Hi there and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Eugene Sepulveda. I'm the CEO of the Entrepreneurs Foundation and the co-founder and CEO of Culturati. We have a really super webinar today, and I want to thank Katherine and Andy for being with us. First, in case there's any new viewers, Culturati is a community of CEOs, executives, managers, and scholars who get the power of culture. You know, we gather around the country at dinners, at seminars, and we have an annual summit where we share our playbooks with each other, and we call in experts to come bring in the latest information. We also commission scholarship and then publish that research result. I want to introduce my two panelists now. So Katherine Gehl is from Wisconsin, is a graduate of Notre Dame and the Kellogg School of Northwestern. She's a CEO. She was the CEO of Gehl Foods, a $250 million business with almost 400 employees. She led the sale of the business to private equity in 2015. And what I find notable is that she was always known for the incentives and rewards that she provided to employees. Katherine has since founded the Institute for Political Innovation, a nonpartisan nonprofit in 2020, to spearhead modern political change in America. She's the originator of the politics industry theory and author of The Politics Industry, How Political Innovation Can Break Partisan Gridlock and Save Our Democracy, which she co-authored along with the esteemed Professor Michael Porter from the Harvard Business School. She's a lifelong philanthropist who served on many nonprofit boards and is honorary co-chair of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers. Katherine served for 5 years on the board of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, a Senate confirmed position. She's worked on presidential and municipal campaigns, so she has the experience relative to changes in our electoral process and what is needed and to provide meaningful results for the American people. The framework, political innovation, that we'll discuss today is developed by Katherine as a business leader. The question that's being posed: why can't our elected officials deliver accountable results? Our current process only serving a few rather than the majority of Americans. Katherine and Michael Porter offer solutions to this problem in their book, The Politics Industry. And also my friend Andy Shaw. Andy is an award-winning Chicago journalist who spent 37 years covering local, state, and national politics, business, education, and day-to-day news at the City News Bureau of Chicago, Sun Chicago Times, NBC5, ABC7, where he was a political reporter for over 26 years. Andy received numerous awards over the years, was named Journalist of the Year by the Chicago Headline Club in 2007, received a Lifetime Achievement Award the following year from the Chicago Journalists Association. After leaving ABC in 2009, he led the Better Government Association, the Chicago-based watchdog nonprofit that shines a light on government and holds public officials accountable. Andy is still active on good government reform boards and is a senior advisor to the Institute for Political Innovation. Andy, I'm going to ask you to get us started, and we're going to mostly hear from Katherine. I'm going to weigh in periodically, but we want to know about Katherine's perspectives, this book, and how we can get America out of this logjam.
Well, thank you, Eugene. And with your kind introduction, it only goes to show that if you live long enough, they've got to give you a couple awards because they run out of people to honor, Anyway, it's my pleasure to be moderating here. Spending all those years in journalism and some in the nonprofit good government space, I moderated dozens of panels, debates from presidential on down, and spoke to many, many groups. So this is a pleasure for me. I think let's start with a basic premise, and then I'll toss it to Katherine to weigh in on where she started and where we're going. I think we can all agree that our Congress in Washington, D.C. is broken, with the exception of a few things that they got done during COVID out of absolute necessity. They failed to get much done on behalf of the American people. And one of the reasons Congress is broken is because we have a dysfunctional political system, a system of two parties that basically self-perpetuate rather than legislate. And with a Congress that's broken and a dysfunctional, polarized, incentivized, and nasty political climate, you can see why people are so upset. The civic discourse has dropped to an all-time low level. And I think it's fair to say that reforming American politics and restoring the health of our tattered democracy probably starts with the Congress. And Katherine will explain later why she isn't looking right now at some of the basic reform principles that we all talk about, like term limits or ending gerrymandering or campaign finance reform. She's focusing like a laser on one thing that she thinks begins the whole process, underpins the process, and basically launches a reform movement that is designed to, in simple terms, restore a democracy that we're all entitled to. So with that in mind, Katherine, you've inspired me. I'm thrilled to be participating even at a small level in this massive nationwide endeavor. But why don't you start by just explaining to this audience, and I don't know if we have 10 viewers or 10,000 viewers, it doesn't matter. It's important that you spread the word as widely as possible. But just explain where you're coming from, why you started the Institute, and then what you chose to focus on in phase one, and why and what it means.
Yes, so Andy, thank you. Eugene, thanks. And everybody who is on the webinar, thank you for being here. I'm excited to talk about this, even though, Andy, when we listened to your introduction here, it is at first blush a depressing topic, which is, to say the state of our political system. But the reason I like talking about it is because unlike the situation I was in 10 years ago, I now believe that we have real levers of change in our political system, which give me a great deal of hope. And so my purpose here today is to answer these questions in a way that leaves those of you listening with a clear idea of what I believe the top priority is that we could all work on in order to have Congress deliver different results as soon as beginning after the elections of November 2022. So quickly, my origin story, basically, I speak to you as a business leader, even though I sold my business in 2015, because that's where my orientation towards this came from, which is here I am in business and I'm saying, wow, it's really clear that in order to do well in business, I have to make my customers happy. So why is it that in politics, neither side of this duopoly has to make their customers very happy in order to continue to do well for themselves, for those people that are in the businesses of politics? Why is there such a disconnect? And so for the first time, I used the lens of competition that we use in our own businesses so often, which is Michael Porter's 5 forces, to look at what was going on in the structure of the politics industry in the way that they competed, and basically came up with this result, which is to say the competition is completely unhealthy. We have a protected duopoly and they're doing great and the customers are not. Now, I want to show you one quick slide to clarify the core conclusion of where the root cause lies. So Sylvie, if you could put up the problem slide, that would be great. So essentially, our political system is designed such that there is no connection between our public officials, those senators and representatives in Congress, taking action in the public interest and the likelihood that they are going to get reelected. In fact, those two things are not only sort of not connected at all, they actually are sort of inversely connected, which is to say that the best way to get reelected is to do what they are currently doing. Gridlock, division, and getting things done that you don't pay for. So even Andy, when you talked about, or Eugene, you said, I can't remember which one of you, that we did get some things done in COVID, and we did, and we put those all on the national credit card. So that's a requirement. I see someone in the chat actually just put up a quote saying a fabulous way to say, it's not broken, it's fixed. That is a line I use very often about our political system. Not broken, fixed, as in, you know, corrupt. So if that's how the incentives work, we as business people immediately know how crazy that is. We would never design our businesses that way to say, come in, this is totally what we need you to do. And then as soon as you do it, you're going to lose your job. But that's how it works in politics. And the reason is because we have party primaries. And party primaries, you know, where we select the one Democrat and the one Republican who are going to compete in the general election. Party primaries are low turnout races. Only 10% of people in the country vote in the primaries that determine the winners. And in over, for example, 80% of races, the winners are determined in the primary, which is to say that if you are in a Republican district, whoever wins the Republican primary is going to win the general election in November. And in blue districts, whoever wins the Democratic primary is going to win the Democratic district in November. And the problem with that is that therefore those winners can only afford to think of and to take actions on behalf of those voters who vote in the party primary that determines their fate. So the general election voters essentially have nothing to say about what our representatives do. It's only those who vote in the primary. And here's how that works. So we've now sent people to Washington, D.C. who are responding to their primary voters. Party primary voters are more politically extreme than voters as a whole. Now, there's nothing wrong with this extreme or that extreme. I mean, people will think there is with the other extreme, but my point is that there's nothing wrong with having extremes, having diverse viewpoints. We in business know that innovation often comes from things that are far from what is a middle ground, let's say. Innovation can come from extremes. So we don't need to get rid of extremes, but we need to not have extremes have veto power in a democracy, which is what they have. So there's one thing that this extreme and this extreme agree on, and that is don't work with the other side. So if approximately half of Congress is Democrat and half is Republican, and they go there and their one instruction is do not work with the other side, that gives us what we've got. That gives us no compromise. That gives us that the only time we compromise, we don't pay for it. And that puts us in this situation where we can't deal with the complex problems that we have.
So that's a good background for the problem, Katherine. And what you've done is, and the only thing you didn't say that I would add is the 80% figure on who wins the general election is a function of the gerrymandered districts that essentially provide sinecures, permanent sinecures for one party or the other in 80% of the districts. That's something that you and we collectively will tackle down the road. But as you pointed out, you've got to start at the root of the problem. So why don't you just tell the audience in a simple way how Final Five works, why we're going in that route direction first, and what you hope to accomplish? Because to me, that's the bedrock of this whole reform effort, is to A, get rid of the primaries, and B, replace them with something that's going to produce more moderate, consensus-driven candidates. So tell us how that works. And I should say the most enjoyable thing in your whole TED Talk was when you described yourself as a political orphan, which I guess is one way of saying that you're not in either party. But explain Final Five, which is your iteration of ranked choice, but with the primary being, basically eliminated as the dispositive effort. So go ahead, because I think that's the exciting piece.
Andy and Catherine, because many of the viewers are from Austin, and we just had an election where we passed ranked choice voting for municipal purposes. It's not allowed by Texas yet, we don't think. So we've got it there so that when we get a decision or we get a state. So we had a lot of conversation about ranked choice voting. And what we're talking about now is open primaries, as opposed to, although I know ranked choice is like number 2 on the list. So just to frame that for the viewers.
Yes, great. Thank you for telling me about that. Okay, so let me step up one level for a moment. So that Venn diagram I showed where there's no connection between doing what needs doing, which is to deal powerfully with complex issues and find a way forward, and the likelihood that people who do that will get reelected. So we have to make that connection. There are a lot of reforms we need to do, and we need, civic education, and we need, inspiring leaders. We need people to do the right thing no matter what they're confronted with. But we are never going to make headway if, for most people, they can't keep their job if they do it the right way, period. We have to do that. So the solution that I propose, called Final 5 voting, goes directly at how we would need to create that intersection. Here's what the solution is. First, and Final 5 voting is the umbrella name for 2 simple changes to our election system. Number 1, let's get rid of those party primaries that produce one person from way over here and another person from way over here who are essentially forbidden to work together and forbidden to find a consensus. Instead, we will have a single primary, a single ballot primary. On the day of the primary, you go to vote and you see all the candidates running on one ballot: Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Greens, Libertarians, all on one ballot. You pick your favorite, just like always, and then polls close and we count the votes. Now, out of this single primary, we're going to take the top 5 finishers and advance them to the general election. So we no longer have a contest between just one Democrat or just one Republican. And we also don't have a contest where we know who won after the primary, because we're advancing 5 people. They could be in a Republican area, 3 Republicans, 1 Democrat, and an independent. It could be any combination, and they all go to the general. Now we benefit from a dynamic competition between 5 visions and candidacies and ideas between the primary and the general. And if there are 3 Democrats or 3 Republicans, they are holding each other accountable in an intra-party kind of way for what is the best way to move things forward. So now we have that dynamic debate, and then in the general election, we need to decide who wins. And that seems like that would be simple, but it's actually not totally as easy as we might have thought, because now that we have the benefits of 5, we don't want to have a case where, for example, one of those 5 wins with 21% of the vote, because the vote split approximately equally 5 ways, because then they would only be responding to a narrow section of the electorate. We need to find which of these 5 has the broadest appeal to the most number of people, who's the most satisfying to the most number of people. And to do that, we will use ranked choice voting, like what you just passed in Austin. I like to call it instant runoff voting, but it's the same thing. Right. So do you think, Eugene, that I should go over quickly how that works, just in case some
Absolutely.
people...
I think you should.
Okay. So instant runoff voting has existed for hundreds of years as a theoretical concept, and also has existed in other countries as actually how they run their elections. So it's tried and true, even though we're not as familiar with it in the United States. Here's how it works. now we have 5 candidates. When you go to vote, you see those 5 candidates. And if you could just bring up the ballot, Sylvie, that would be great. And you have an opportunity to rank the candidates in order of how they appeal to you. And you'll see this on the ballot. So here, I'm actually voting here on Wisconsin professional sports teams. So I have my first choice, my favorite team that I think is the best. And I don't even know who it is on here, but you don't need to fill out this. You don't need to actually fill out the boxes, Sylvie. So Sylvie's my assistant who's helping move the slides. So in any case, I choose my first choice and I circle it in just like we did on all those standardized tests. And then, okay, but if I can't have this team, then I'll take my next choice. Let's just say the Bucks are my first because they won the NBA championship. I'll take them. But if I can't have the Bucks because they don't win, then I'll take the Brewers. And if I can't have the Brewers, okay, I'll take the Packers, all the way down to that my last choice is, let's say, the Milwaukee Admirals. I hope there are no Admirals fans on this broadcast in Texas. And then when the polls close, all the first choice votes are counted. If one of those 5 candidates has a true majority, great. The election's over. They have over 50%. It's all done. They win. But if none of the 5 has over 50% of the first choice votes, then we begin a series of runoffs. The candidate who came in last place, 5th place, is eliminated from the contest. And if you had selected that candidate who's now out, if you had selected them as your first choice, your single vote is now automatically transferred to your next choice. Then we run the totals again with the remaining 4 candidates, look for a majority winner. And then if we don't have one, we eliminate the person in last place. Voters who had selected them have their single vote transferred to one of the 3 remaining who are still in the race. This continues until you know which of these candidates has the broadest support of the electorate, has over 50% support. And that's how we get the winner. Now, here's the key. Final 5 voting, which is a combination of this top 5 primary and ranked choice voting general election, gives us a great winner, yes. But I will note that final 5 voting is not designed to necessarily change who wins. It doesn't necessarily mean that whoever is a senator or representative now would not win under this system. What it's designed to do is change what the winners have the freedom to do and are incented to do and on whose behalf they're doing it, which is to say now, whoever wins under this system has the freedom of action to use their talent and leadership to negotiate, to deal make, to deal with complex trade-offs, and to vote yes on a compromise solution that is the best way to move the country forward on a particularly difficult issue. They can actually say and vote out front the same things they say behind closed doors that right now they just don't have, quote, the political will to do. And that's the reason they can do those things now, is because they're answering to the general electorate, which includes all kinds of different people. They're not just answering to a narrow slice of their own party. So they have opportunity, they have latitude for action. So we want to change what our winners have the freedom to do now. The second piece is that now they have the freedom to do that because they can see a path to re-election for themselves. They know that if they vote yes on the bipartisan deal on immigration or education or healthcare, that they have a path to re-election. They won't 100% for sure lose their primary. They know that they'll be in the top 5 and they can make it to the general election. And then the second piece is they know that there's accountability built into the system. Right now, if you're a Republican running in a red district, even if you have a Democratic opponent and they say that you aren't doing a good job, that doesn't hold you accountable because you've already beat them before the race even started. If it's a Republican district, now let's say there's 3 Republicans and they are competing for who's going to represent that district, and they are holding each other accountable. For the first time, we won't have just a duopoly where you never face any real competition in the general election. The general election will always be the election that decides, and that puts accountability in, because we know in competition that it is the threat of new competition that propels innovation, that propels improvements in how we all do business to serve our customers. That is the competitive dynamic that is missing from our political system that we get in Final Five voting. So in summary, we get more freedom, but also accountability. That's
Okay, Catherine, let me,
Catherine.
so let's move if we can. And by the way, just so the audience knows, we're going to end the conversation portion about 15 minutes before the end. And so we can then field the questions that have come in. Catherine, let's move this ahead because it's important to move from the theoretical to the practical. You've done a marvelous job of explaining how it works, but now as you head toward 22, there's a daunting challenge, and that is to actually put this into effect. So there's 2 questions now. The first is the easy one to answer. You can explain the national campaign and the efforts in 2022, but then I don't have to ask it again. Somebody can, or you can just pick it up at the end of that. You need to tell us how you make this happen when, again, you're dealing with the entrenched systems that don't want change. You can take that in either order. If you want to take the challenge ahead in dealing with entrenched parties that want to maintain the duopoly, fine. But the other is the importance, the mechanics. How do we get Final Five in enough districts to actually affect congressional behavior? So go in either direction, but try to deal with both. Okay,
great. So first of all, let me deal with the how do we make the change? So Article 1 in the Constitution gives all the states individually the power to make the rules for elections, including for how they elect people to Congress. So theoretically, every state could make different rules about how they elect people to Congress. And there are underneath different rules that we see from time to time when we say, wait, how come they do it totally differently over there? So we take advantage of Article 1 and ask the states to make these changes. That brings us to the second piece of the opportunity, which is half the states in our country have a process called a ballot initiative. Now, you don't have this in Texas, and we don't have it, for example, in my state. So let me explain what that is. A ballot initiative bypasses the legislature to change things. It puts a question on the ballot that citizens can vote for. And if they vote for it at 50% plus 1, then they win. In general, it works that way. So you've heard of this a lot in California. You know, they're always having Proposition 8, Proposition 13, Proposition whatever, and then the Californians vote for it. And that's how something becomes law to bypass their dysfunctional legislature. So we have 2 methods of change. Use the ballot initiative process in any of those, approximately 25 states, or in any state, we can use the legislature. The legislature can pass the bill and the governor can sign it. That's how you make it happen. I want to say what's really exciting is that Final Five voting is itself no longer just a theory, because we already have success in Alaska. Alaska passed this bill for Final Five voting by ballot initiative in November of 2020. So their 2022 elections will be held under this system. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A because it's going to be a really interesting race. You'll have the incumbent, and you'll have who's a Republican, and you'll have a challenger supported by Trump, and you'll have a Democrat. It will be fascinating. So that's how we make the change. In 2022, our goal, those of us, at my organization, plus people we work with in this industry of political change, we want to pass a minimum of 4 ballot initiatives. And we ideally will have this running in, let's say, 2 blue states, 2 red states. We've narrowed the field down to about 10 states right now, but we're not sure yet which are the 4 that have the best path to victory. So we're still working on that. And that doesn't sound like very many, but let's look carefully. If we pass it in 4 states plus Alaska, we have 10 senators, and we don't know exactly how many representatives, it depends on which state, but we have 10 senators who have now been freed from the tyranny of the party primary. They're Democrats and they're Republicans, but they aren't beholden to only the extremes of their bases. So they have a lot of latitude. And in a Senate of 100 people, 10 people who have the ability to work across the aisle are enormously powerful. You think of them as like a fulcrum, and they can actually change what Congress can accomplish as soon as the day after this happens in November of 2022, if we win. Because people don't have to wait to be elected by this system for their incentives to be changed, because it is the election they're going to have next that changes their incentives. Of course, it gets better over time as you actually see more competition, but incentives and freedom of action are liberated immediately after we win.
So Katherine, long-term, this is several election cycles. I know we've talked about Illinois, which is probably down the road. Texas is probably down the road. California, New Jersey. There's some states that are going to be poor targets to begin with. And I know the first time around, you're going to pick 4 good targets. And so just so people understand, each of those states, you'll launch petition drives and you'll need X number of signatures. And if you get them and they're valid, this goes on the ballot. And I got to be honest, having covered this many times as a political reporter, when you put something popular that changes this dysfunctional system on the ballot, you have a real good chance of winning, because you're offering the voter a chance to reform a system that he or she cannot reform at the ballot box with the current system of primaries ruling the election. In other words, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, Donald Trump can't determine the positions you take in a Republican primary any more than Charlie Schumer can do that on the Democratic side, or Joe Biden. So let me just ask another practical question here. This is a major undertaking, and it's a very expensive one. How do you get buy-in to basically run these campaigns in all these states? I mean, petition drives and the advertising are expensive, and you've got to get support at the local level to make them happen. I know you haven't formulated the entire game plan, nor should you share it now in specificity, but how do you see this unfolding over the next 12 months?
Yeah, it's a great question, because look, we all know we could have the greatest idea for our startup, but if we can't fund it, it's just an idea. So the good news is, first of all, I feel like I should have a pitch deck, like to my VCs or something. The amount of capital needed for this relative to capital that goes into the politics industry every day to get the current terrible results that we're getting, it's extraordinarily, it's the best ROI out there, is what I should say. So if we think about this, we spent as a country, although only a few of us and not me contributed to it, but in the Georgia Senate race, which was a battle over who was going to hold 2 Senate races, and one of them was only going to be held for 2 years, that race, about $1 billion went into it. Final 5 voting in states across the country will cost, to deliver it, anywhere from $5 million in a small legislative state to, let's say, maybe $200 million in California. But it's about an average of maybe $25 million per state. So think about the four that we need to win in 2022. It will cost between $50 and $100 million to deliver those wins. I call it 100. I don't want to be caught running out of capital, in October of 22. And so that is a lot of money. It's just not any money at all when you think about the leverage that gives us and the fact that we could see a more functional Congress. One of the advantages we have is that there is one thing that even today unites almost everyone in the country around politics, and that is this idea.
Catherine, let me, if I may.
Congress is broken. So people don't agree if their state legislature is broken. They don't agree if the presidency is broken. They don't even agree if their particular senator or representative is broken, but they think Congress is a mess. Republicans, Democrats, independents, everybody. So we're all in this together. And because final five voting is not a Trojan horse for like party advantage, it doesn't help Democrats more than it helps Republicans or hurt one more than the other. It actually helps everybody. We can raise money from across the political spectrum, and we do. We want these campaigns will be run by the states. This isn't like you parachute in from outside. We come in to help sell the idea and seed and incubate the campaigns, and then they are run by teams in those states and led by leadership in that state. And we will try to raise as much money as we can from within the state, but we also look at funders across the country, because for us, even if our two senators don't get to benefit from these new incentives, we benefit from having any two senators have these new incentives, and people from around the country will contribute and are contributing as well.
Catherine, I think I said something in the intro that I didn't ask you to explain because I think it's important. I maybe made an assumption, but I think you need to explain it to people who will wonder about it. Having worked for a good government organization with a reform agenda and having covered politics for so many years, there are a lot of reform ideas that have been out there, the subjects of fights for decades, and this isn't one of them. I mean, people have said, we've got to do something to get around Citizens United and reform campaign finance. We've got to end gerrymandering. We've got to do other things about when our elections are held and things like that, and ballot access. There's so many things that are regarded as reforms to the political system. And yet you chose, and those are, I should tell the audience, all of those are they're in your book, and they're all part of the long-term plan. This is not a one-trick pony. But why have you focused so much time and energy, and will be a lot of capital, on this one, as opposed to the more traditional reform efforts that I mentioned?
Oh, it's such a good question. Sylvia, if you could bring up the Venn diagram of powerful and achievable. So when I got into this, it's just like our businesses, which is strategy is about choosing what not to do. So you always have to make a decision about where to put your resources. And we have to do that in this as well. People often think that politics and the political system and all of these things are sort of less rational than the business environment. And I do think there's less rational behavior because of the dysfunctional rules that incent the wrong behavior. But the way we should look at our decision-making when we want to make a change there is using the same kinds of decision-making tools that we would have to deploy capital in our business, which is to say, we shouldn't do things just because they seem good or moral or democratic or fair or representative. I love fair, I love representative, I love democratic. All those things are good, but we have to be more clear-eyed about it. So the question I ask and that I put to you is, we want to know what is the best thing to spend our time on? And that is whatever is at the sweet spot of being both powerful and achievable. By powerful, I mean likely to change the ability of Congress to deliver results in the public interest. By achievable, I mean that we can get that powerful benefit in a matter of years, not decades. When you take almost all the most popular current ideas and ask if they are both powerful and achievable, they don't end up in the sweet spot. People might love them emotionally and they might feel right. Like people are outraged by gerrymandering. They think that's wrong. And it is voters choosing their politicians choosing their voters instead of the other way around. But the fact is, if you changed gerrymandering, if you got nonpartisan gerrymandering everywhere in the country, or nonpartisan redistricting everywhere in the country, but you left party primaries intact, there's so much natural sorting that you would still leave the party primary electorate in control of what Congress could do in far too many cases. If you want to change, let's say, the Electoral College, we don't even have to debate whether that's powerful or good powerful or bad powerful. We can just say, is it achievable in years, not decades? And because it requires a constitutional amendment, it isn't. And so everything pretty much sorts out of not being on this at this sweet spot of powerful and achievable. Or when I talk to finance people, I talk about final five voting being at the efficient frontier of powerful and achievable. It's basically the optimal investment that's available to us that can change results the fastest.
I have one more question, and then I think Eugene will basically field some of the questions that have come in from the audience. It's actually a two-parter. One, are you at liberty to share with the audience any of the states that you're looking at, or would you rather keep that list of 10 confidential till there's been more vetting? And secondly, what are you going to say to, whether it's in this audience or anywhere else, to the people who say, all of this reform stuff is liberal democratic politics. If you look at everybody who calls for reforms, it tends to be the progressives, because by definition, the conservatives are happy to conserve the system that they now have. So how do you answer folks who say it's more liberal gibberish attempting to undermine a system that's fine in place? And then secondly, whether you want to talk about individual states, and then I'll back off and let Eugene weigh in with some questions.
Great. Okay, so your first question, can I share the states? No, it wouldn't be super helpful to share the 10 now, but what I can share is I'll tell you who they're not. Okay, so first of all, remember, only half the states have ballot initiatives. So for example, it's not Texas, it's not Wisconsin, because Texas doesn't have a ballot initiative. Then 2 states, for example, that have ballot initiatives are Florida and California. Those would be massively expensive states to do this in. So it's not Florida and it's not California. Then my own preference, although, I'm, of course, not God, I won't control this all by myself, but I don't want to run this in swing states, because then, even though this would have nothing to do with how a state would vote in the presidential, this wouldn't affect that. It would make people worry that there was a partisan agenda in it, right? So we try to narrow down from that. And then we're narrowing to, again, ideally 2 blue, 2 red, if we can find a sufficient path to victory in all of those, because we're not going to also invest money in something that we don't have a path.
This feels like 20 questions. Is it bigger than a bread box?
Is it bigger than a bread box? What do you mean?
I'm just kidding. It's one of the questions. That's one of the 20.
You're right. I'm not even
20
following.
questions. We're narrowing down to 4 states, but we're going to give that up now.
Right.
Go back to the other point about
okay. I'll go back to
the question you'll get about whether this feels like another one of those left-wing efforts to undermine a system that people are happy with. At least some portion of the electorate are happy with the current.
By the way, I wasn't trying to make it a 20 question game. I was more trying to say there's this logical rubric that you go through, and then it ends up where it ends up. And I have grandchildren.
That's the problem. I play 20 questions with them, so please excuse me.
No. So, okay. So here's the thing. I never talk about being in political reform. I only talk about being in political innovation. And there are multiple reasons for that, but I've actually created a distinction between those two. I would say that reform is often tinkering around the edges, or it wants to make things more fair or more representative. And it's not to say I don't support many of those things. It's just that that's what it does. Whereas innovation is breakthrough and changes results and outcomes. So Final Five voting is so deep in the system and changing the incentives that it's a political innovation. It's not a political reform. And here's the other thing about political reform. Political reform is almost always a Trojan horse for party advantage. Even when things are more fair or more representative in theory, most of the time, many times, the money is going into those efforts because people look at the current electoral landscape in our duopoly and think that their preferred side of that duopoly would do better if that reform were implemented. And in many cases, they might be right about that. So this, and again, let's put that aside to say Final Five voting is not something that that is a Trojan horse. It doesn't have that inherent benefit. And some of that goes that Final Five voting will alter competition and it opens it up and lots of different people can run, but existing people can win under this system as well, as long as they're doing what the public, the general election voters want them to do. Now, the reason this appeals to conservatives as well, and we really have a Noah's Ark here where we bring in conservatives and liberals who traditionally like change more than conservatives who, as you said, Andy, want to conserve, is because this is really all about competition and free markets. So I like to call this free market politics because I'm all about, free markets as well. I think that's where you get a lot of benefits. And in many ways that can be a bit more associated with some of the policies that the conservatives espouse, which is this value of markets. So the orientation of this is opening up a market and deregulating what has happened in the politics industry with party primaries and all of the barriers to entry over time. So that kind of takes that liberals might come to it because they like change, conservatives might come to it because they like free markets, and they both come to it because, once again, they agree that Congress is broken.
Eugene, you want to pick up with some of the questions or thoughts of your own?
And so I'm going to remind people on the webinar that the ideas that Katherine and Michael Porter put together about competition are included in their book. And I'm going to ask Sylvie to drop the URL link for the organization that Katherine's put together in the chat. So people that are at the webinar can learn more. And if you want to opt in to get more information, go there and leave your information. Katherine, and then the other thing I want to remind the viewers is Final Five voting is the comprehensive phrase that Katherine and the Political Innovation Institute are using to incorporate open primaries and ranked choice voting. And I like how they're being promoted as one, because it really is a 1-2 punch that gets you, almost a knockout is in terms of political reform and change.
Yeah, let me say, Eugene, for a second, this top 5 primaries, instant runoff general election is very different than ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting on its own.
Right.
On its own, it's not even half of what the combination is, which is to say that ranked choice voting on its own may often change who wins. It will not change what the winners have the freedom to do or are incented to do and on whose behalf they're doing it.
Yeah, let me just say that New York was New York, of course, had got all the publicity, and I can just say that what was regarded as a fiasco in New York was simply some significant errors by the election board and not the problem with the system itself. I mean, but the problem, as Katherine has pointed out, is it was just done in the party primaries. And so you basically, yes, you went through some voting, some shifts in votes, but at the end of the day, you got a Democrat who will be elected mayor of New York without competition from Republicans and will really not have to govern in a bipartisan fashion because Republicans will not have even had a chance to compete, you know, other than the one person in the final election.
Well,
so eliminating the primary and moving everybody along really changes that.
If we want to talk about the ultimate cluster, is here goes the recall in California, where if the governor doesn't get 50%, then the next governor will likely have 17%. It's just crazy. Anyway, let's move on to some questions. And Sylvia, Katherine, you alluded to this, which is the difficulty that those of us that don't have ballot initiatives would have in getting these passed because you have the duopoly in charge of the legislatures. Are you at all hopeful that we could pass Final Five voting in legislatures run by, without a ballot initiative?
Yeah. So in 2017, that's when I put out my first work, which was a publication with Harvard Business School. And at the same time, I co-founded with another Wisconsin CEO, an organization called Democracy Found in Wisconsin, which pushes for Final Five voting for Congress in Wisconsin. That was 2017. Our bipartisan legislation was introduced this year in April in our legislature with 22 co-sponsors from both sides. We have a Noah's Ark of business leadership, and we are on track to pass this legislation in 2023. All the way back in 2017, when I showed the people I was going to get the initial support, I showed that the first time we could pass it was 2023. In a legislative state, it's going to take 2 to 3 legislative cycles, which is to say 4 to 6 years, because you have to do all of the work and get all of the buy-in, and then you have to have a governor elected who's interested in signing it.
Yep. Right.
And so our election is in 2022 for governor. And then if we have a governor who wants to sign it, then we might be able to get it done then. The key in a legislative state in many cases is going to be that you have to make sure you run this for Congress only. You can't. You will have much harder time asking the legislature to change the rules on their own heads. Whereas like Alaska, who passed this by ballot initiative, they passed it for their state legislature and Congress. But in legislative states, I suggest we just focus on Congress because again, that's where the agreement is.
Great nuance there. And of course I will say Wisconsin is like, y'all are so nice. So maybe y'all can come to agreement there.
They're not.
I don't know that in Texas.
They're not nice in Madison. Katherine can tell you that. They're not nice in the state. They may be nice in the rest of the state, but not in the capital.
You know what? Tomorrow, I want to say something. Tomorrow night, I'm hosting a cocktail party, like just a personal cocktail party with all these people in Wisconsin who've been working on this. And I think we might be the only bipartisan elections effort in a legislature, sort of in the country right now. And these are real partisans who have come together to say, we agree on this. We, like our 2 lead sponsors, they wrote this article, this op-ed, and actually the 2 people who wrote the forward for my book are Mike Gallagher, a Republican representative in Congress from Wisconsin, and Christy Houlihan, a Democrat from Pennsylvania in Congress. And the theme of both of these, our 2 co-sponsors and people who wrote the forward, is look at all the things we don't agree on, but look at all we do agree on, our belief in our country and democracy, et cetera. And that leads us to say, we believe together in Final Five voting. And when you read this stuff, it's just so inspirational to see them say this matters more than something we could do for our, policy advantage on our one side.
Hey, I'm going to ask David's question, and we may have hit on it. He says, if you do not have a majority winner, would these runoffs occur the next day? When do you get official results? And Katherine, you touched on that quickly, but I think we may need some further clarification of how instant runoffs work.
Yes, it is a very good question. So the algorithm, the software for running an instant runoff voting election, which is to say, count up all the first choice votes. If nobody has a majority, you get rid of who's in last place and you transfer the votes. That actually can occur instantly. I mean, I bet there are people who started in programming on this call who could program the software to do that. That software exists, it's available. Here's the problem. Now that all votes matter, so we in the United States have gotten used to knowing who wins the day of. And one of the reasons we can do this is because most votes don't matter. So you only have to get a plurality. So you only have to beat the other people. You don't have to get over 50%. And you can usually see when the networks make their predictions of who's winning, you can see as the votes come in that someone is getting far enough ahead that there aren't enough votes outstanding for anyone else to, compete against them. Plus, in most cases, we already know months in advance who won because we know that it's the primary, but they still wait to have like some numerical evidence that that's occurring, and then they call the race. But now, because everything will change based on the runoffs, you can't call it in advance. You have to actually count votes. What an interesting idea in a democracy that everybody's vote is going to matter. And now in many states, you have absentee ballots that in certain states, they come in even later and you have to wait for those. So it's not going to initially create results that are available the evening of. Over time, when we implement this, as long as we're willing to have absentee ballots come in by the day of the election, we will be able to implement systems to have the results that night.
Yeah, can I say one thing?
That's not what's going to happen in Alaska, because they are going to centralize the ballots from around the state, which will take time because their votes matter. So so we can have the votes, the result the night of. Let's just make sure that to do that, none of our votes will matter. That's, a trade-off we're going to have to make. And you'll see that happen in Alaska. They won't know the winner the evening of in November of 2022.
Yeah, and I think it's important to answer David. I think there was a little confusion when you talk about instant runoff. That doesn't mean that anybody has to vote a second time. That's just a computerized function of moving votes around. So David, you don't have to come back the next day for the runoff and then choose somebody else. What you do on election day is all that's necessary. The rest of it has to do with, as she says, the algorithm of moving the votes around in a computer program.
Time for one more question. I want to, those that are participants, there's a survey link in the chat. If you would do that for the review of today's session. And let's end on Jonathan's question. He's like, Katherine, what is your view of the For the People Act? Should this 800-page political reform bill include two fundamental changes like open primary and ranked choice voting?
I will answer the second half of your question. No, the For the People Act should not include final five voting. Here's why. We should change these rules in a bipartisan fashion. Conservatives do not want to make these changes at a federal level because that's just part of what they believe. So Article 1 allows these changes to be made by the states. We covered that earlier. The federal government could do it, but if you did it by the federal government, only liberals mostly would vote for it. So then it would be not done in a bipartisan way, which would mean half the country would think it was a bad thing just because of how it was done. So the best thing is let's do it in the states so that we can get bipartisan buy-in and not fight about it after we get it done. But I would like to add, I would like to end with one more thing, if I could, Eugene, which is how
Go ahead,
people could
Katherine.
get involved.
Sure.
Okay, first of all, if you like this, we'd love to start a campaign in Texas. They take, 2 to 6 years. If you're interested in founding, contact me at katherinegehl.com, and that'll be in the chat. Also, if you want to support our campaigns in 2022 and what's happening nationally, please get involved and contact me. We're having, a national finance committee. We're doing all these things. And then if you could spread the word, nobody's heard of this, right? We all have heard of gerrymandering and term limits and electoral college and everything, and For the People Act. This is happening. It's the real deal. We already won in Alaska. So please share the word. If you like what you heard, look at my TED Talk. Just Google Katherine Gehl and TED. It's 17 minutes and takes people from 0 to 60 on this topic. And I'd really love it if you would share it, particularly on your social media, or if people, with people that you know well. So be in touch if you want to be involved. We'd love to hear from you.
Katherine and Andy, our time's up. Thank you so much. Katherine, thanks for, this passionate work that you're doing on behalf of democracy.
Oh, I love it. And thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And also I want to say, Sylvie, thanks for all your help. Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Have a
Eugene.
great day.